when dreams inhabited in sleep take on substance in the daylight hours, terror reigns. I was about 16 when such a dream first came to me. It would always start with me at the door of a big red brick house, where, I understood, I was going to stay. The servant who opened the door told me that tea was being served in the garden, and led me through a low, dark-panelled hall with a large open fireplace, onto a cheerful green lawn, set around with flower beds. There were, grouped about the tea table, a small party of people, but they were all strangers to me, except one, who was a schoolfellow called Jack Stone. I remember, somewhat astonished to find myself here, for the boy in question was scarcely known to me, and I rather disliked what I knew of him. The afternoon was very hot, and an intolerable oppression reigned. We sat in the shadow of the house, but on the far side of the lawn was a red brick wall with an iron gate in the centre, on the other side of which could be seen a walnut tree. At the end of the house stood a tower of 3 stories, which looked to me to be much older than the rest of the building. Before long, Mrs. Stone, Jack's mother, who, like the rest of the party, had sat in absolute silence, said to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you a room in the tower." Quite inexplicably, my heart sank at her words. I felt as if I should have known that I would have the room in the tower, and that it contained something dreadful and significant. Jack instantly got up, and I understood that I had to follow him. In silence we passed through the hall and mounted a great oak staircase with many corners, and arrived at a small landing with 2 doors. He pushed one of these open for me to enter, and without coming in himself, shut it behind me. Then I knew that my conjecture had been right. There was something awful in that room, and with the terror of nightmare growing swiftly and enveloping me, I awoke in spasm of terror. Now that dream, or variations on it, occurred to me intermittently for 15 years or so. Most often it came in exactly the form I have just described: the arrival, the tea laid out on the lawn, the deadly silence succeeded by that one deadly sentence, the mounting with Jack Stone up to the room in the tower where horror dwelt. And it always came to a close in the nightmare of terror at that which was in the room, though I never saw what it was. At other times I experienced variations on the same theme. Occasionally, for instance, we would be dining in the dining room, but wherever we were there was always the same silence, the same sense of dreadful oppression and foreboding, and the silence I knew would always be broken by Mrs. Stone saying to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Upon which, and this was invariable, I had to follow him up the oak staircase with many corners, and enter the place that I dreaded more and more each time that I visited it, in my sleep. In my waking hours, I never once met Jack Stone again during all those years, and I never saw a house that in any way resembled the dark house of my dreams. And then something happened. I was residing in London at that time, and I was invited down to stay with a friend of mine, Jack Clinton, in the first week of August. He had a house for the summer in the Ashdown Forest district of Sussex. We spent a pleasant afternoon golfing, and then we drove on to his house in the late afternoon. Our way lay through deep, high-banked lanes, and before we had gone very far, I fell asleep, and was only awakened by the stopping of the motor. And with a sudden thrill, partly of fear, but chiefly of curiosity, I found myself standing in the doorway of that house of my dream. We went, I half wondering whether or not I was dreaming still, through a low oak-panelled hall and out onto the lawn where tea was laid in the shadow of the house and the walnut tree. The facade of the house was very long, and at one end stood a 3-storey tower, markedly older than the rest. Here for the moment all resemblance to the repeated dream ceased. There was no silent and somehow terrible family, but a large assembly of exceedingly cheerful persons, all of whom were known to me. And in spite of the horror with which the dream itself had always filled me, I felt nothing of it now, just a curiosity as to what was going to happen next. Tea pursued in cheerful course, and before long Mrs. Clinton got up. And at that moment, I think I knew what she was going to say. She spoke to me, and what she said was, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." John turned to me. "We're absolutely full up, old boy. The room is at the top of the tower. Would you like to go and see it now?" "Oh, by Jove, I believe that we're going to have a thunderstorm. How dark it has become." I got up and followed him. We passed through the hall and up the perfectly familiar staircase. Then he opened the door and I went in. And at that moment, sheer unreasoning terror again possessed me. I do not know what I feared. I simply feared. I looked around and found that nothing had been changed in the room of my dreams. Just to the left of the door was the bed, lengthways along the wall. In line with it was the fireplace and a small bookcase. Opposite the door were two lattice-panelled windows, between which stood the dressing table. On the fourth wall was the washing stand and a big cupboard, and my dinner clothes were spread out on the coverlet of the bed. And then, with a sudden start of unexplained dismay, I saw that there were two rather conspicuous objects which I had not seen before in my dreams. One, a life-size oil painting of Mrs. Stone. The other, a black and white sketch of Jack. His picture hung between the windows, looking straight across the room to the portrait, represented by Mrs. Stone, which hung at the side of the bed. I felt once more the horror of the nightmare seize me. The picture that represented Mrs. Stone showed her as I had last seen her in my dreams, old and withered and white-haired. But in spite of the evident feebleness of her body, a dreadful exuberance and vitality shone through the envelope of flesh, an exuberance wholly malign, a vitality that foamed and frothed with unimaginable evil from the narrow, leering eyes. It laughed in a demon-like mouth. The whole face was instinct with some secret and appalling mirth. The hands clasped together on her knees seemed shaking with suppressed and malign and nameless glee. Then I saw that it was signed in the left-hand corner, and wondering who the artist could be, I looked more closely, and I read the inscription, "Julia Stone, by Julia Stone." Then there came a tap at the door, and John Clinton entered. "Got everything you want?" he asked. "Rather more than I want," I said, pointing to the picture. He laughed. "Hard feature, old lady," he said. "Oh, scarcely a human face at all," I said. "It's the face of some witch or devil." He looked at it more closely. "Yes, it isn't very pleasant," he said. "Scarcely a bedside manner, eh? I'll have it taken down if you like." "I really wish you would," I said. He rang the bell, and with the help of a servant, we detached the picture and carried it out onto the landing and turned it to face the wall. "By Jove, the old lady is awake," said John, mopping his brow. "I wonder if she had something on her mind." The extraordinary weight of the picture had struck me too. I was about to reply, when I caught sight of my own hand. There was blood on it, in considerable quantities, covering the whole palm. "I've cut myself somehow," I said. John gave a little startled exclamation. "Why, I have too," he said. Simultaneously, the footman took out his handkerchief and wiped his hand with it, and I saw that there was blood also on his handkerchief. John and I went back into the tower and washed the blood off, but neither his hand nor mine was there the slightest trace of a scratch or a cut. It seemed to me that, having ascertained this, we both, by a sort of tacit consent, did not allude to it again. The heat and the oppression of the air increased very much after dinner, and for some time most of the party, among whom were John Clinton and myself, sat outside on the path bounding the lawn, where we'd had tea. The night was absolutely dark, and there was no twinkle of a star or moon ray. By degrees our assembly thinned. The women went up to bed, and the men dispersed either to bed or to the billiard room. And by 11 o'clock my host and I were the only two left. All evening I had thought he had something on his mind, and as soon as we were alone he spoke. The man who helped us with the picture had blood on his hand too. Did you notice? He said. I asked him just now if he had cut himself, and he said he supposed he had, but that he could find no mark of it. And where did that blood come from, do you suppose? I don't know, said I, and I don't really care, as long as the picture of Mrs. Stone is not by my bed. He got up. But it is odd, he said. Now you will see another odd thing. His dog, an Irish terrier by breed, had come out of the house as we were talking. The door behind us into the hall was open, and a bright oblong of light shone across the lawn to where the iron gate with the walnut tree stood. The dog's hackles were up, and he was bristling with rage and fright. His lips were curled back from his teeth, and he was growling to himself. He took not the slightest notice of his master or myself, but stiffly and tensely walked across the grass to the iron gate. There he stood for a moment, looking through the bars and still growling. Then all of a sudden his courage seemed to desert him. He gave one long howl and scuttled back to the house with a curious sort of crouching sort of movement. He does that at least half a dozen times a day, said John. I walked to the gate and looked over it. Something was moving on the grass on the other side. I lit a match, and I saw a big blue Persian cat walking round and round in a little circle just outside the gate, stepping high and ecstatically with their tail carried aloft like a banner. Its eyes were bright and shining, and every now and then it put its head down and sniffed at the grass. At that moment, I remembered the other horrible detail from my dreams that I had seen through the gate just where the cat was now standing. I had seen a white tombstone with a sinister inscription. But then, as I tried to recall the detail, the rain began, as suddenly and as heavily as if a tap had been turned on, and we ran to the house for shelter. Somehow, with the picture of Julia Stone in the passage outside, the room in the tower had absolutely no alarm for me. And as I went to bed feeling very sleepy and heavy, I had nothing more than the interest of the curious incident about our bleeding hands and the conduct of the dog and cat on my mind. The last thing I looked at before I put out my light was this empty square space by my bed where the portrait had been. I blew out my candle and instantly fell asleep. My awaking, however, was instantaneous, and I sat bolt upright in bed, under the impression that some bright light had been shone in my face, though it was now absolutely pitch dark. I knew exactly where I was, in the room where I had dreaded in my dreams, but no horror that I ever felt when asleep approached the fear that now invaded and froze my brain. Immediately after a great clap of thunder crackled just above the house, I became aware that something was in the room with me. Instinctively, I put out my right hand, and my hand touched the edge of a picture frame hanging close to me. I sprang out of bed, upsetting the small table that stood by it. There was no need of light, for a blinding flash leapt out of the clouds and showed me that by my bed again hung the picture of Mrs. Stone. Instantly, the room went back into darkness, but in that flash, I had clearly seen a figure leaning over the end of the bed, watching me. It was dressed in some close clinging white garment, spotted and stained with mould, and the face was that of the portrait. Overhead the thunder crackled and roared, and when it ceased and the deadly silence succeeded, I heard the rustle of movement coming nearer me. And more horrible yet, I perceived an odour of corruption and decay. Then a hand was laid on the side of my neck, and close by my ear I heard quick-taken, eager breathing, and a voice already familiar to me spoke. I knew you would come to the room in the tower, it said. I have long been waiting for you. At last you have come. Tonight I shall feast. Before long we will feast together. And the quick breathing came closer to me. I could feel it on my neck. At that, the terror, which had paralysed me for a moment, gave way to the wild instinct of self-preservation. I hit wildly with both arms, kicking out at the same moment, and heard a little animal squeal, and something soft dropped with a thud beside me. I took a couple of steps forward, nearly tripping over whatever it was that lay there, and by the merest good luck found the handle of the door. In another second, I ran out on the landing and banged the door shut behind me. Almost at the same moment, I heard a door open somewhere below, and John Clinton, candle in hand, came running up the stairs. What is it? He said. I sleep just below you and heard a noise as if, good heavens, there is blood on your shoulder. I stood there, or so he told me afterwards, swaying from side to side, white as a sheet, with the mark on my shoulder as if a hand covered with blood had been lain there. It's in there, I said, pointing. The portrait is in there too, hanging up in the place we took it from. At that he laughed. Oh, my dear fellow, this is merely a nightmare, he said. He pushed by me and opened the door. Phew, what an awful smell, he said. Then there was silence. He had passed out of my sight behind the door. The next moment he came out again, as white as myself, and instantly shut it. Yes, the portrait is there, he said, and on the floor is a thing spotted with earth, like that which they bury people in. Come away. Quick, come away. How I got downstairs I hardly know, but in time we came to his dressing room on the floor below, and there I told him what I have described here. The sequel to this story is short indeed, and some of it you may already have guessed. You may remember that horrific but true story that occurred in the churchyard at West Forley some 8 years ago, quite close to where we are, where an attempt was made to bury the body of a certain woman who had committed suicide some 3 times. On each occasion, the coffin was found in the course of a few days, again protruding from the ground. After the 3rd attempt, in order that the thing should not be talked about, the body was buried again elsewhere in unconsecrated ground. And where was it buried? Just outside the iron gate of the garden belonging to the house where the woman had lived. She had killed herself in a room at the top of the tower in that house. Her name was Julia Stone.